Okay. Good morning. Welcome back. Over Ben Izmanim, I came across a book called The Rabbi's Suitcase. Maybe some people have seen it. It came out a few years ago. It was from a British retiree, like an older British guy who retired. And he said in his family, it's really his wife's family, his wife's grandfather and great-grandfather and great-grandfather, they had a suitcase of mechtavim. And basically, today they're very Britishized, this family, but originally they had came to England as, I believe, from Litta. Both of them came from Litta. They had close relationships with Yitzchak Elchanan and with Shmuel Salant and Shmuel Moalever. They were Litvish Rabbanim. One ended up on the London Bezdin. One ended up as a Rav in Gateshead. And they corresponded pretty extensively. Like thousands, I think it came up like 6,000 pages of correspondence that these two Rabbanim had with different Litvish Rabbanim. One of them's name was Rabbi Reinowitz. One of them's name was Reb Sussman Cohn. I don't think either one of them is very famous today. But this retiree collected his nachlas avosav, the suitcase full of ksavim from his great-grandparents. And I don't think it was ever published into Svarim, these various tshuvas that they had. What he did is he put out a book called The Rabbi's Suitcase, where he just, in chapters, he codifies what the topics of discussion were. Like, what were the tumults, what were the things that were going on at that time that people were writing about? Back and forth, a bunch of them are about agunis, shipwrecks and agunis. A bunch of them are about shchita and kashrus. And then in the middle there, I came across a chapter where there was another Litvish transplant who ended up in England. His name was Rabbi Naftali Halevi. And this person, Rabbi Naftali Halevi, put out a book in, I don't know what it is, like the late 1800s. He put out a book called Toldas Adam. The Toldas Adam, the creation of man. And the tachlis of the book was to laud and to hail how great of a contributor to Yahadus Charles Darwin was. That was the tachlis of the Sefer. He said, in the Hakdama he writes that Charles Darwin is a big benefactor of Klal Yisrael. He's helped Klal Yisrael tremendously by proving how the Torah is correct. And then he proceeds in the book to go through all of Parshas Bereshis and parts of Shemais, parts of these parshas that we just read. And each pasuk, and with his readings or misreadings, figure out how this is exactly what Charles Darwin meant, and et cetera, et cetera. Now, for most of us, this is Fremde Zachen, so I'll just give a quick introduction. Charles Darwin is another Brit, an English naturalist in the late 1800s as well. He was supposed to be a doctor, a medical doctor, but he decided that he really, really enjoys, the natural world. And in 1831, he took a ship called the HMS Beagle, and he went on a 5-year tour of the entire world, of the natural world. And during that tkufa, he took down notes of a lot of what he found. In particular, he was very phenomenal with the wildlife that lived on the Galapagos Islands, off of South America. And eventually he comes back to England and he writes a book called The Origin of Species, which became an overnight bestseller, where in The Origin of Species he basically suggests that there's no need for God in the picture of creation. You could take God out of the picture of creation, and he has a theory of evolution, it's called. Now, everyone's familiar, everyone's heard of the theory of evolution. Theory of evolution, simply put, I'm no scientist, simply put, is that all of everything that's that's alive and created on planet Earth all stems from one original ancestor, which was the simplest, living thing in the world, like one atom or one molecule of life, and from there it branched off, and over billions or millions or trillions or whatever the number is of years, it branched off into a tree of evolution and all sorts of terrorists. Now, I want to talk about evolution a drop just to show the easy counter arguments, meaning to show why evolution is not such a convincing theory in the first place. But I'll do it. I'll splice it in as I talk about some of the different gedalim and tshuvas and controversies that this played a role in. But this Reb Naftali Halevi, he put out the Sefer Toldas Adam, and in it he had a haskama from Reb Shmuel Moalever. Now, Reb Shmuel Moalever was a Russian Rav who was considered to be a Talmid Chacham, a Bar Samcha. He was a bit of a Zionist, so in our circles he's less famous today. But he was a Bar Samcha. He was a somebody. He was a Talmid Chacham. He wasn't a nobody. And when this Sefer Toldas Adam came out and had haskama from Shmuel Moalever, another Litvish Rav who was living in England at the time, whose name was Rabbi Yosef Kayin Tzedek, started kicking up a big fuss and writing to all different Rabbanim that this is kfir, it's not oisgehalten, and Haytachan dem Shmuel Molever could give haskama to this, and that's how it ends up in these rabbi suitcases, because they're involved in this back and forth, this rabbinic discussion between all these various Litvish and Russian transplants who ended up in England, in London, in Manchester. They're involved in this argument. Now, incidentally, in this suitcase, there's a letter from Shmuel Molever, who sends a copy of the letter that he wrote to Rav Naftali Halevi, and shows how Rav Naftali Halevi did a media job on it. How he excerpted a paragraph here and a paragraph here and turned it into haskama. He says, I'll send you the full letter, and you'll see that what I wrote to him was absolutely not haskama. I said it's unacceptable, it's clear, it's not allowed. He took whatever 2-3 paragraphs of pleasantries are in my letter, and he copy-pasted them and turned it into haskama. So he actually sends a full copy of his non-haskama to the Sefer, to clear his name, and this is the tumult that happens there. Now, the problem is that these people, all of them, all 4 of them, I think, are, besides Rav Shmuel Molever, at least 3 out of 4 are complete unknowns, with very, very little, so whatever they fought about, or whatever this discussion about evolution that happened in their time and in their place, happened in their time and in their place. It doesn't bear any relevance to us today. So I want to talk about some of the more maybe famous pieces of this controversy throughout the Dairis, where we could see different strands of how the Gedolei Yisrael, the Chachmei Yisrael, looked at these scientific theories and worked with them. Now, I just want to start as a hakdama. I want to start with a tshuva from the Rivash. The Rivash has a tshuva. I think it's to the Maram Chalava. It's not clear, but I think it's a tshuva. It's a set of 2 tshuvas to the Maram Chalava about a complicated yibum shaila with a woman who was pregnant with a baby. The baby was born for a certain amount of time. It's a complicated yibum question. And in the middle of the second tshuva, clearly the Maram Chalava, or whoever the shaila over here is, had written something about a scientific theory to try to ascertain what the status of this pregnancy was. And this is what the Rivash writes in this tshuva. He says, B'dvar ha'shayla, yadata ha'adon, she'en lanu ladim b'dina tereseinu mitzvesea, al pichach me'ateva v'arafua. You know, my friend, my master, we're not supposed to dan the Torah's mitzvahs and the Torah's dinim and mitzvahs, al pichach me'ateva v'arafua, based on doctors and naturalists. Shem namen l'divreim, ein Torah min ha'shamayim chalila. And this is, the Rivash is writing this in the year, let's call it, give or take, 1425, I don't know. Way, way, way before Charles Darwin, before anything of modern science. He's writing this ancient, in the, the middle, I don't know what you call it, the beginning of the Renaissance. I don't know, it's a long time ago when the Rush is writing this. They, with their false experiments, decided that there's no Hashem. Then all sorts of things won't be like the Torah says. Then he continues, he says, V'harambam zal, kishashana ma'at, when the Rambam differed a little bit from Chazal and said something scientific in Hilchos Treifus, v'amar shatzemes agidin, heim be'etzem atachtem ba'ifus, loy haidu loy. He says all the Rishonim, the Ravid, the Magid Mishnah, the Chuvas Rashba, others, the Beis Yosef, obviously holds like this, bring down that, no, we don't pass like this Rambam. He says even the Rambam, who was a Groise doctor and was a very religious man, when he bent the halacha a little bit to the medical side, they didn't agree with him. Because the mashmayis of the Gemara was not like him, so they disregarded this. Well, in Iska B'Talmud, then he says, the Rambam was a surgeon, he was a doctor, he was a scientist, he was extremely knowledgeable, and because of a diak from a Gemara, mashmayis and the Gemara not like the Rambam, all these other contemporary Rishonim of the Rambam disagreed with him. We don't live based on the natural and the teva and the science. We'll be saying on our chachamim. I feel yomer lana yimin shu smol shehem kiblu ha'emes upirush ha'mitzvahs ish mi piyesh ad Moshe Rabbeinu aval shalom. Because the chachamim from a kabul the Torah ish mi piyesh Moshe Rabbeinu. And then this is a line that has been twisted in all sorts of ways. That's why it's an important line. The Rivash says as follows: It says leinamen el chachmei Yevanim ve'Yishmaelim. Let's not trust or give any credence to the chachma of the Yevanim and the Yishmaelim, the Greeks and the Muslims. Shaloi dibru rak misvaroisam. They only speak from their svaras. And some sort of test that they made to try to prove it. Without paying attention to how not airtight and how not complete their scientific experimentation was and how not proved their theories were. Not like our chachamim who did only things that were mamash airtight. Now, he said, Ani mevi rayim, and he brings more now. what people, some who have been on the side that want to say that, like Tolbas Adam, like this Feretz Alevi, have said, you see from this Rivash that the Rivash would agree that airtight scientific experiments are something that should be incorporated in the Torah. Like that's the takeaway line from this Rivash. Now, in context, this is very similar to Shmuel Moral Lever's Haskama. The Rivash is not at all saying that scientific experiments should be the basis and when they're airtight. Fakert, the Rivash is saying that we have a Mesorah Ishim Piyesh Meisher Rabbeinu Alav Shalom, and Chazal, when they quote something based on their scientific experimentations, were perfect. But the Chachmas HaYevanim and the Chachmas HaYishmaelim, which is one could say indicative of all modern science, the same thing, is, even though it's based on experimentation, is often far from perfect. And evolution is a perfect example of this. If you want to hear a real deep dive into this and the back and forth, Rabbi Lapiansky has like a 6-part series on evolution, like the science of it, and evolution, like everything else, it starts as a theory. It started with Charles Darwin saying a theory, perhaps. He has a suggestion. He was faced with a few scientific problems, and he had a suggestion. Maybe I could suggest that the reason why A, B, and C, and let's say the problems he was faced with were, for example, he was faced with the problem that all of everything on the world seems to be made of the same material. Rocks are not rock material, and humans are not human material, and animals are not animal material. They're all made of the same molecular and biological buildup. It's just the way the molecules bind to each other. Are they harder? Are they denser? Are they softer? Are they more free-flowing? How do they react to hot temperatures? Meaning that there's many, many differences between how these molecules organize themselves, but they're all the same molecular makeup, for example. Or Darwin had a problem. He said if you look at all mammals, the bone structure is similar, meaning the bone structure on a lion is the same as a human, more or less. The arm has the same pachas yoser structure of bones. If you look at some fish, the fins have similar bone structures to even a human. Well, I have a teretz. I have a theory. Maybe they all stem from one ancestor, from a long time ago. Now, this was a theory that was said very lofty, without paying attention, without testing what the mathematical statistics are, etc., etc. So this was a theory. Now, what happens is eventually the theory, for whatever reason, became extremely popular, and it turns into like an Indian Shaldas. It turns into like a religion of its own. It becomes a religion of science, where even if you don't have answers, you say, listen, I don't have all the answers, but Mistama, future theorists of science, will figure out how what I'm believing now will be true. It becomes like a religion. It becomes very similar to religion, where you just say, even though I don't have the answers, and I can't answer everything, I believe it because Mistama it will be true. And there are many, many examples of holes in this, and I'll just share a few of them, like now. You know what, I'll save it for Aaron Feldman. Aaron Feldman, in a letter that he wrote pretty recently, addresses this, and we'll save it for there. Now, one of the main places that people try to bring a riot to evolution from, and Aaron Feldman addresses this as well, is a Ramban in last week's parsha. Now, I'll read it again because let's get it in context. The Ramban, in the beginning of Parshas Bereshis, he stelzach on the two words that are used for creation. There's a word bara and there's a word yatzar. There's a word called yitzira and there's a word called bria. There are two different words that are used. Now, the Ramban says as follows. He says, he's going on the pasuk that says, "V'ha'aretz yisayu v'vayu, v'chayshich al pnei tahayim, v'ruach l'himar achafas al pnei hamayim." So says the Ramban, "V'ata shma pirush hamikra, al pshutay nachon ubara." Let me explain to you this pasuk the proper and straightforward way. Hakadosh Baruch Hu bara kol hanivraim me'afisa muchlatas. Hakadosh Baruch Hu created all creations from total nothingness. Yesh me'ayin. Ve'en etzleinu b'lashon hakodesh b'yitzah yesh me'ayin el lashon bara. The only word in Lashon Kodesh that's used to describe creating something from nothing to something, yesh me'ayin, is the word bara, bria. Ve'en kol hanasa tachas hashemesh oil ma'ila ha'ivim me'ayin tchila rishona. There's nothing like this. Aval hoitzi me'nefes ha'gafon. This is the thing. Now, he says, if you'll notice, the word bara is not used a lot in the Bereshis. The bara is used once. And then it starts saying Yitzira, the word Yitzira. So it says the Ramban, and this is a famous Yisaid, and I can't tell you what this actually means, but the Ramban says Yisaid that the first step of creation that HaKadosh Baruch Hu made was he created something called Chemer Hiyuli, which is a Greek word. It means he created matter, let's call it. He created the existence of matter. And then later on, Hashem formed every separate thing in the world with that matter, meaning it was like putty or clay in HaKadosh Baruch Hu's hand, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu was able to form everything. Now, so there are those who say this is Darwin. That the Ramban is saying there was one original ancestor. Hashem created one kernel of matter, of something, of thing, and then everything formed itself in this pattern. Now the Ramban is like a 3-page Ramban, but he's absolutely not saying that. The Ramban is describing words, bara and yitzira, and saying the way the creation happened is that Hashem created Chemer Hiyuli, which is like the blank material to do things with, and then of course the Ramban learns the Psukim Kipshutam that on every one of the days HaKadosh Baruch Hu created things perfectly. There's only a distinction between yesh me'ayin and yesh me'yesh. It's not a distinction in happening on its own. It has nothing to do with the theory of evolution. It's purely a distinction between yesh me'ayin and yesh me'yesh. Creating something from zero and creating something based on matter that existed already. So the Ramban says the word yotzer is used when HaKadosh Baruch Hu organized things from the Chomer Yuli and turned it into a cow, turned it into the sun, turned it into a human, turned it into whatever he turned it into. Now, Rabbi Aaron Feldman in his letter addresses this Ramban also, and when I read from it, we'll see it as well. Now, there's a more controversial person who discussed similar themes that became I don't know how known it is, but this was a problematic discussion. The Tosfos Yom Tif, the Torah Yisrael is probably probably the top three Mefarshim of Mishnayos, right? Ever. The Torah Yisrael is you say that anyone who learns Mishnayos learns Torah Yisrael. You can't learn Mishnayos without Torah Yisrael. Now, the Torah Yisrael in his Sefer very rarely discusses anything that's Agadah. The Torah Yisrael is a Sefer on Mishnayos. He discusses the Mishnayos, the Lamdus of the Mishnayos, the Pshat of the Mishnayos, the Sugis that the Mishnayos relate to. It's a straightforward Lamdish Sefer. In a few places, the Torah Yisrael discusses Agadic themes. In the end of Nezikin, he puts in a drasha called Drusha Arachayim, which is a drasha that we'll discuss in a minute. And in the end of Masechtas Kedushin, he puts in a Homa Rachel about Moshe Rabbeinu's natural midas versus his developed tendencies. These are the two times that the Torah Yisrael puts in things that are drushtik, and both times the Torah Yisrael puts in drush, he gets in trouble. The Mishnah, the one in the end of Masechtas Kedushin spawned the whole controversy. Whole svarim were written to discuss it. Now, granted, many Chassidish svarim say the same thing, and we should save it for another day. It's worth discussing on its own. Why? What was so offensive? Why it's so offensive? Who said it before him? Who said it after him? It's a separate discussion. We'll get back to it. But this Drusha Arachayim in particular drew the ire of many people. Now, I found a letter. The Nesivis had a son-in-law, Rabbi Elazar HaKohen, who lived in Varsha and became a Katzke Chassid. He was a Chassid. He became a Chassid. The Nesivis' son-in-law. And in a letter that the Nesivis' son-in-law writes to the son of the Torah Yisrael, the Torah Yisrael's son was the one who was publishing the Svarim, and the Nesivis' son-in-law, Rabbi Elazar HaKohen, writes a letter to the Torah Yisrael's son, where he takes a very interesting tact. It's coming in the middle of a conversation. This letter is obviously not the first letter. He writes, it seems that the Torah Yisrael's son had wrote to him, how could you have tainus on what I published here for my father? Don't you know that the Chedush Rim, the Ger Rebbe, was a big fan of the Torah Yisrael? How could you, ostensibly a chassid of that world, of Polish Chassidus, have a taina on my father Torah Yisrael? So he writes like this. He says, Masha Kasav Kvoi Teirasei, Asher Kvoi Dadeneinu Meirenu, Harav Atzadik Meir Vitzlak Meirzal, Chiviv Dvar. This that you told me that the Chedush Rim liked the Torah Yisrael. He says, Mila Yechaviv Sefer Kizeh. Big kunz. Who wouldn't like the Sefer Torah Yisrael? Every time that I'm learning Mishnayos, I'm ma'ayin in his words with love. He says, B'drishas al Agada, when he wanders into Agada, ein azman maskim iti la'ayin. I should run at a time to be ma'ayin in the Agadas that he's sharing. Ube'ena yipala, and it's a strange thing, he says, in my eye. Eich rav gadol kasher haya aviv zal. How such a big rav like your father, v'sefer nichbad kazeh, and such a chashav v'sefer like this is, yehi nidvas etzle drashas Agadas. He says it's beneath the dignity of the Torah Yisrael to put an Agadah the drashas into such a chashav sefer. Takes a very interesting tact to convince him. He says, of course, the sefer is a wonderful sefer. Everybody loves it. The Chdushim loved it. I loved it. Everybody loves it. That's an argument. But faket, because it's such a wonderful sefer, it doesn't make sense to me that you should stick in these Agadahs. He says, Nirim yahagdelim rishonim. Look at the Gdelim rishonim. Akaydim v'achronim. Whenever they had Agadahs, he says, the Ran put his drushes separately, but he didn't put it with his pirush on the Rif. It's not like in the back of the Rif the Ran put drushes. He has drushes around. It's a separate sefer. Gam Chaysni, Rav Agadah says, my Shver the Nesivis had a lot of Agadah to say. We know the Nesivis had a lot to say on Chumash and other things, Megillah, Chumash, separate Svarim. He didn't put in the back of the Chavas Das a drasha on he didn't put in the back of the Nesivis a drasha on Cholamoyed. He separated them. It's not Lefich Chaydi that a Chashav Sefer should have this. He brings a few more examples, and then he says. But for some reason you're not masking to take it out. He says, this is not a miyat in the cover of the Torah Yisrael to take it out. This is a mentioned Zagin in the Medrash. It says, Hamar be'kvoid HaKadosh Baruch Hu memayit kvoidei, kvoid shemayim misrabu, kvoidei gam kein misrabu. It says if someone focuses on being mar be'kvoid shemayim and doesn't focus on his own kavod, HaKadosh Baruch Hu is covered in this Rabbah, and what ends up happening is you're covered in this Rabbah also. He says, don't worry that you're taking out some of your father's Torah. He says, take it out, it's not a problem. Now, the Torah Yisrael's son does not agree, and writes back like a short letter. He says, Ayin Hakdamas Rabbeinu HaMarsha, Kama Hikbid Lebilti Hafrad Shmaitza Me'agadata. We know the Marsha has Chudush Agadas and Chudush Halachas, totally intertwined. He says the Marsha writes in the Hakdama that Agada and Halacha is one limud and you can't separate it. V'chein Asa Rabbeinu Anei de Behuda and the Tzlach, and the Rabbeinu Hafla. So he says, you brought me a list of Gedolei Achronim who separated, I bring you a list of Gedolim who didn't separate it, kept it together. And he says the Rambam didn't separate his biurim on Parak Chelek from his biurim on other Mishnayos. The Rambam left them intertwined. And he says the Rambam Loyoid, even within the Pirush Mishnayos and Parak Zayin, the Kalim, Parak Aleph, the Alis, Siviv Dvarav Hakdoshim Mehalacha LaHagada. So I'm not asking with your critique, and I'm going to leave it in. Now, what is this very controversial piece that the Nesivos, his son-in-law, is petitioning to have taken out, and Torah Yisrael saying he's going to leave in? So this is something called Drush Arachayim. It's hard to find it sometimes in the Mishnayos now because it's there, but it's not there. It's not always in the right place. Originally, it was published in the back of Nezikin. In the end of Nezikin, it was a Drush Arachayim. I remember reading somewhere, I don't remember where anymore, that Rabbi Victor Miller, whenever he would walk into a shul, would check if it was in the Mishnayos, and if it was, he would pull it out. Because Victor Miller was a big anti-evolutionist, like a campaign, a big educator and campaigner against any blurring of the lines, and he would pull it out. And someone once asked him, but the other side of the page, it has other things on it. Oile Rosh, Oile Shkeva. He would pull out the Drush Arachayim, and this, I don't remember where I saw this, but I remember seeing this from Victor Miller. Now, this Drush Arachayim is a fascinating drasha about Chias HaMesim and lots of things. But in Ois Gimel over there, the Arachayim bring, the Torah Yisrael brings like a shmooze about human curiosity. He says humans are super curious. They want to know always what's going on in the world. They want to learn. They want to gain. They want to see. And he says it's like a whole piece. I don't know how much of this I can read for you, but he's writing about the dawn of the Chachma of paleontology, which is the Chachma of digging up dinosaur bones and fossils and organizing them into species and figuring out. He writes that, I have somewhere an English translation actually, it might be easier to read from there. He writes that he heard about woolly mammoths who were dug up deep in Siberia, and he heard of a creature that was dug up outside Baltimore. He writes, you could get a spelling for Gittin from this. He writes he heard of a creature that was dug up outside Baltimore that was 19 feet long and 9 feet high till its body started, and all the details of his mind is blown by the details of these creatures and dinosaurs that are being dug up, these woolly mammoths, these dinosaurs that are being dug up from the rock, he says. And I can't get to the point of it is that he uses it in a very similar vein to Rav Naftali Halevi in Talvas Adam. The Torah Yisrael uses this to say, look at the Chachma of the Bria, look at the depth of the Bria, look how much is unknown to us in the Bria that HaKadosh Baruch Hu created. And he says, Ivest Mefragin, the way dinosaur fossils are found is that there's many layers to the earth, and they're found in different layers, deeper down in the rocks, they'll find fossils. He says, why are they not with anything else? How did they get there? Whatever. So he brings a medrash in Bereishis Rabbah. It's a famous medrash. Amar Avavo, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu HaKadosh Baruch Hu was creating worlds and destroyed them. So he says the world, the globe that we're on, is a composite of many, many destroyed worlds. HaKadosh Baruch Hu was Beirei Lamas Machrivim. So the same world that we live on is layered of all the old worlds that were here before us, and it was destroyed layer upon layer. This is how he stims the finding of dinosaurs in various different layers of rock with Hashkafas HaTorah, and he's fascinated by this and thinks that it's a marvelous new find. Now, the reaction you see is complicated. The Nesivos son-in-law says, take it out, it's not it doesn't belong there. That's his reaction. The Minchas Elazar, who was burned a little hotter than this, he writes in a tshuva, this is an interesting excerpt in a tshuva, in Minchas Elazar Chelik Aleph, in Tshuva Samach Daled, he writes as follows. The Shoyel had wrote him, it's a sugi about a Mishnah in Yadayim, a Shver Mishnah in Yadayim, and he writes that Ayin Tveres Yisrael, that he teaches it kacha v'kacha. So the Minchas Elazar is writing back to the tshuva, and in there he writes, he says, this that you wrote to look at Tveres Yisrael, Ein ha-Sefer Tveres Yisrael Mishnayos tachas yadi. I don't have the Sefer Tveres Yisrael Mishnayos. Ki husar mi beitenu. It was removed from my household. Be'ez yirinu drush. When I saw the drush, karo, when he says karo arachayim, he calls it the light of life. He's very dismissive of it. Shnit fasham, pay attention here, mi b'noi b'seif nezikin. His son put it in b'seif nezikin. V'yesh b'deis nifsadas noitis l'minas rachman l'tzlan. There are days there that are no good, that are noitis to minas, that are not good. V'inyin chidash ha'olam, about creation, about borderline evolutionary type of talk. V'ulai, he says, ha'mechaber naki. It could be that the mechaber is clean of this ill. Ki hayam aforsim la'adam gad of akasha. The Torah Yisrael was known to be an adam gad of akasha. He was a grace mention. Kveger corresponds with him. He was an adam gad of ma'id. U'benoi ziyif b'shmai. But his son maybe put it in his name. Al kapanim sham nimtza advarim zarim umarim. Al kain enenu itanu. It's not with us. Now this is just a cute hedge. Mechazal writes, rakim and it's starach lirisplay. When I need to see it, be'itim rechaykim binyan halach and nishlach achar v'shayil lachzirei. So the Mechazal didn't destroy it. He sent it to say in someone else's house. He says, when I need it very badly, I send it to bring it back over here and I look it up. So it's just like it's a cute hedge the Mechazal is doing over here. But the Mechazal says, I kicked it out of my house because it has in it things that are not okay. But in my mind, the mechaber is kosher still, and it's just his son who's stuck in things that are not okay. And when I need it back, I bring it. But obviously, this conversation he was having with the Shail over here, that wasn't neat enough, and he didn't bring it back. So he says, I'm not aware of this shtickle in Torah Yisrael. Now, the Stipler in the letter in Krayna Degrisa has a much more a well-rounded take on this whole Torah Yisrael that I want to read, and in it is a lot about what we're talking about. The disciple is writing about someone who's writing to him, again, about stimming science with the Torah and trying to make it all work. And he says as follows. So, Advar shemetzinu, Mamari Chazal, shemashmoisim l'chayri k'may sha'olam, sha'olam advar harekim. This thing you sent me like a list of different chazals that to you seem to sound like they could agree with what these scientists are suggesting. And he brings a few of them. Fine. Then he continues. He says, there used to be nisim that helped people have a munah. The Kolshkim, the Ikvis of the Mashiach, and Eskayim, the Malay, Vanoichi, Haster, Shehester Panim Atzum, Oid, V'din Garm, L'chal Mini, Bilbulim, B'darke, Emunah, Vashem Yisbarach, B'teirasi. He says, the fact that there's Hester and there's no Monisim anymore, and Klal Yisrael is not able to see things so clearly, is what allows the rise of these different theories and these different ideas that are anti-God, that people could believe in. And then he brings the different counts of the Dairis, talks a little bit. And then he says, Valdas Reiki Atayr, and this is reminiscent of the Rivash. 500 years later, the disciple writes very similar. Valdas Reiki Atayr, called the Reim, Ela Hal Hasharish, Shidufis Kadim. They're on these vague hasharas, the vague assumptions, theories that are not fully proven. Also, you're not even supposed to go down and argue with them. He says, besides for the general isser to engage with kaifrim in the first place, the mission says, stay away from this, he says. Ella, now here's where we get to Torah Yisrael. Ella, Torah Yisrael al-Mishnayis. The Torah Yisrael al-Mishnayis, he says, B'ro'isa kilkul hadar. When he saw the kilkul hadar and how weak people were in the Yanim of Amunah, he sought to be makar of these people who were distant from Torah. He says, there's a lot to say about what he says over there. But I can't because Chazal don't allow me to even have this conversation. This that he quotes, this is the crux of it, the same thing that the Mechazal took offense to. This that he quotes, this Bereshis Rabbah from Rabbi Vo, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu was Beira Elamas Machrivim, Shaybayne Elamas Machrivim, Misvar Hated B'Sifrei HaKabbalah, is well explained in the Sifrei HaKabbalah, Winyan Malchim Kadmon, Shemesei Farsi Vishalach, V'ein Lo Noisik B'N Stars, but I don't know Kabbalah, so Ayin Shem over there. This is the disciple writes. The disciple says, whatever it is, it's a Kabbalistic theme, it means something, Ayin Shem, I don't talk about it. He says, V'ine B'chol Dar, every generation, Chayshvin Bali HaMechkar, the scientists think they think in this dar we've reached the pinnacle of where you could reach. Now we know everything, he says. Others come, they come and they dig away, they add on. I've seen in a science book that was published hundreds of years ago, where the author writes Lahedya. We've come to the conclusion of science, and we know everything that a person could know. He says, now, 300 years later, there's come out nothing that scientists believed 300 years ago that's still true. Almost everything's gone. So he's doing the Rivash with a little more, flavor and detail. That even a theory, even a thing that seems convincing, is not to be taken so seriously. You could understand and poke the holes and understand that it's not such a convincing theory. Now, where this became the most relevant, obviously in recent memory, was when young Koheling man from Beit Shemesh and Mir Yeshiva by the name of Nassim Slifkin put out a whole bunch of books about this. And we're running out of roads, so I brought the Kol Korah from the Gedolim, but I really just want to read an excerpt from Aaron Feldman's letter that he wrote in that tumult, and we'll end with this. I read it, he says it's English, and this is one of the more convincing arguments. He writes this, he says, Slifkin goes on to posit that the theory of evolution in one form or another is a fact, only mentioning in passing that those eminent scientists who have discredited this theory because the discovery of the DNA molecule makes it statistically impossible. Now, what he's referring to, or Aaron Feldman is referring to, is one of the main arguments that Kedai to know, is that the DNA code is comprised of, let's say, I don't know, millions and millions of code, like, computer programming, so to speak, that tells each cell how to behave. Now, it was recently decoded, like in the early 2000s, they finally decoded the code into millions of, protein molecules and numbers to decode it into a code. Now, the idea that something so complex, like the DNA molecule, could become on its own, meaning it's something that needs millions of numbers in it, for that to evolve from something that has zero numbers to millions of numbers, mathematically, and I'm no mathematician, is 1 to the 400 times, I saw an article about this once, I can't even do it justice, but meaning the example was given was an early scientist said that if you'd sit 6 monkeys down with a typewriter at random for their entire life and let them type, eventually they'd write Shakespeare. That was the scientific. That was the theory, so to speak. That was the theory of evolution. Now, later scientists, with the discovery of the DNA molecule and the understanding of how complex every tiny, tiny detail of the bria is, have concluded that if you were to sit down all monkeys that ever lived for all of time, and they would type for all of time, they still would be off by 1 with 30 zeros to the power of whatever, the mathematical stats that they would write even Shakespeare, which is much, much less complex than the DNA code. So, Aaron Feldman is referencing this Nakuda, that the theory of evolution as it is sounds very nice, like theoretically, but when you break it down mathematically into like an algorithm, it's off by crazy numbers, the likelihood of something like that happening. So he writes this, that he doesn't mention the fact that it makes it statistically impossible. He says, according to Slifkin, when the Torah says that man was created, it means that the human species evolved until a certain point when the species were invested with a divine spark. Now, this is not even the part that I want to read you. I take it back. This is his the DNA part's important. Now he says like this. Okay, it is what it is. Well, to be continued. I can't go for an hour.
You've just experienced another Torah class brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.